We look at a lot of economic indicators on this show. There's an interesting one that's coming up and emerging here. A growing number of money managers are looking at data documenting protests in China as they try to predict what Beijing may do next to boost its economy. Let's get to our Asia government and economy correspondent, Rebecca Chung-Wilkins. She's been investigating and joins us now. So, Rebecca, tell us more about what this story is about.
Well, this has been one of my favorite stories to report because, in a way, it's the story behind the story. For the last couple of years, we've been reporting quite heavily on the different kinds of indicators, the different kind of metrics that we can use to really understand the fallout of the slowdown in the Chinese economy. So everything from, outrageous local government fines, unemployment levels and private data sets for employment, new hiring, as well as direct protests and incidents of dissent in China, particularly around economic issues. And those stories I found have triggered these really interesting conversations with my contacts, with investors, with terminal clients, providing feedback that they too have increasingly been trying to use this data and trying to make sense of this data when it comes to thinking about that social unrest risk. And one thing that I think really underscored, particularly for foreign investors, the importance of this data was what we see behind me. Back in 2022, when China pivoted, President Xi Jinping pivoted on the COVID lockdowns, a really unexpected, abrupt move that took, I think, many foreign investors in particular by surprise and underscored the importance of these social unrest factors when it comes to triggering big 180s in policymakers' approach. So again, the emphasis here is now thinking about how to use this data when it comes to understanding the stimulus that Beijing might be willing to roll out to support the economy and prevent these types of risks.
That's a good point. And might this be, I guess, why we're here right now talking about, 6 weeks from the policy pivot? How is this actionable for investors?
Absolutely. Well, one thing that, one sort of metric or gauge that perhaps is useful for investors, or Morgan Stanley is hoping certainly it's going to be useful for investors, is this social dynamics indicator that they launched just a couple of months ago. Again, underscoring how important this alternative data set is becoming. They look at a whole different range of different metrics, so things like labor incidents as well as employment levels, essentially to create a score. And what they've done is they've run that back in time. And what we see are these two key points, that when we see a drop in the decline in the levels of essentially social satisfaction in China, that they have pivoted, they have created these two big pivots. So back in 2015, when we saw the shantytown renovation stimulus move after weak PPI, and again back in 2022 following those COVID lockdowns. Now, it's not a precise science, so it's not a particularly really clean chart per se, but what is interesting is that you can see this quite clear correlation between these big policy pivots and these stresses that we see in the social dynamic. So just one way that investors are trying to use this, economists at Morgan Stanley said that this decline that we see right here is partly why we may have seen that bigger than expected, earlier than expected stimulus blitz announced back in November. Robin Xing, Morgan Stanley's China chief economist, saying that we are not yet at that threshold for a big policy pivot, but that we are certainly close.
Yeah, I mentioned that. We're close to the threshold. We're close. He came on a few weeks ago to tell us a bit more about this gauge. So tell us a bit more about what this protest data tells us about overall just discontent in China.
Yeah, so this is China Dissent Monitor data that we see. They have been tracking protest data back from 2022. And we do see this sort of marginal uptick, gradual uptick towards the end. So when we look at it on a quarterly basis, we saw a jump of 18% year over year in the second quarter. We're just waiting for the third quarter data to come in, but we're expecting that to be upwards of 22%. So certainly a rise. The other key element that's interesting is about 3 3/4 of the protests documented in this data set are economic grievances. So these are issues related to unpaid wages for construction workers, issues related to the property sector, homeowners not receiving their property or not receiving property that they think is up to scratch. So certainly we see that, again, that correlation between the economic stresses, the financial stresses that are really weighing on people.